Welcome to the Money Metals Midweek Memo, news and commentary relating to sound money, the precious metals markets, and the economy. I'm your host, Mike Maharrey. Thanks for tuning in. Saturday Night Live couldn't have scripted it any better. So picture this. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was standing behind a podium recently, taking questions from reporters. And one of the reporters asked, "How concerned are you about the potential impact of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency?" Now, the reporter hadn't even gotten the question out of her mouth when the Treasury Department seal literally fell off of the podium and hit the floor with a series of dull thuds. I will post a video of this on the show notes page. The look on Yellen's face as she kind of bends over and looks around the front of the podium to try to determine what caused all the commotion was absolutely priceless. It was a mix of befuddlement and I think a little bit of amusement. Now, my first thought when I watched the video was that, man, this is an eerily symbolic moment. Like, even the universe knows that the dollar is in trouble. I thought a commenter on X summed it up perfectly. Even the Treasury sign is giving up. But is the dollar really in trouble? Given that the BRICS nations just wrapped up their fall summit in Kazan, Russia last week, and all of the talk about the bloc's desire to find dollar alternatives, I think today would be a good day to delve a little more deeply into that question. Now, I'm going to start by offering up a little bit of a confession here. I think I misjudged the immediate threat that BRICS poses to the dollar. And I've probably overstated my case in some of my articles about the BRICS bloc over the last year or so. Now, that said, I still think the dollar is in trouble. How long it takes for that trouble to really play out and manifest, that's the $64,000 question. So let's start with this BRICS summit, and we'll kind of use that to dive into a little bit more of a discussion on what's really going on with the dollar. Leaders and representatives of 36 nations attended the meeting, so that included the BRICS members, but also leaders from other countries that are interested in joining the bloc. For anybody who might not be familiar, BRICS is an economic cooperation bloc, and it's been in existence for quite some time. It was originally made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. As of January 1st of this year, the bloc expanded and now includes, additionally, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Ethiopia. And Saudi Arabia has also been formally invited to join the bloc, but, well, it depends on who you asked. Apparently, they haven't formally accepted the invitation, although a lot of media outlets include them in that BRICS mix. We've also got Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Malaysia, which have formally applied to become members of the BRICS bloc. Now, when it comes to unseating the dollar as the reserve currency, it's kind of like the spirit is willing, but the BRICS is weak. In other words, I think a lot of the member countries would love to see the greenback taken down a peg or 50, but it's easier said than done in a world that runs on dollars, right? It's kind of like the people who would love to get rid of oil, but they're still driving around in big limos and flying on private jets, right? It is a fabric, oil. It's a fabric of our global economy. So is the dollar. So for obvious reasons, Russia is pushing the hardest for de-dollarization. And looking back at recent articles I've written about BRICS proposals for a new currency, for alternative payment systems, and other policies that have been brought up to minimize dependence on the dollar, almost all of these plans have come out of Russia. And if you kind of read the articles, you'll see that the releases and the documents, they're all coming out of Russia. Now, Of course, it's easy for Russians to say, hey, let's stop using dollars because, well, they're generally barred from using them to begin with. That's not the case for China, India, or any of the other BRICS nations. Yes, they certainly see the danger posed by America's weaponization of the dollar, but their economies still depend significantly on the global dollar system. So the willingness of other BRICS nations to push really aggressively in the de-dollarization direction is a little bit limited right now. And I say right now because that's at least for the time being. Now, that's not to say that the recent summit completely rejected de-dollarization. The idea remains very much on the table. However, it's becoming increasingly clear that it's not going to be a quick, easy process, certainly not as quick and clean as Vladimir Putin might like. As a report by the South China Morning Post put it, quote, few countries in the grouping seem ready to ditch the U.S. dollar, despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent efforts to encourage an alternative payment system among members. Now, I wrote an article about a month ago outlining the plan to create an alternative payment system for the BRICS nation. It was going to use a blockchain. And again, it was primarily being pushed by the Russian delegation. In fact, I think the reporting for that came out of TASS, which is a Russian news agency. I'll link to the article I wrote about that in the show notes page. As I mentioned, it comes as no surprise that Russia is pushing for this, right? The U.S. and her Western allies have locked Russia out of the dollar-based SWIFT system. As Reuters noted, the economic sanctions even impact Russian trade settlements with friendly countries, such as China, because, well, China's local banks worry that they could get hit with secondary sanctions by the U.S. if they continue to do business with Russia. Now, again, people might not be familiar with SWIFT. If you've listened to the show, I've talked about it before, but SWIFT is it's basically an international payment system. It serves as the global economy's superhighway. It's basically just a global financial messaging service, and it facilitates cross-border payments. As the SWIFT website puts it, quote, SWIFT is the way the world moves value. Sounds really kind of cheesy, but that's what it says. Since the dollar serves as the world reserve currency in this system, SWIFT effectively facilitates an international dollar system. It's based on the fact that the U.S. is the reserve currency. Now, ironically, back in, I think it was 2018, I did an interview with RT. That's the English language Russian television station. And I warned about the United States using the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And I think I might have mentioned this before on the show. I got fact-checked after I did that interview, and the fact-checkers deemed that I was wrong, and my concerns about the weaponization of SWIFT were overblown. It wasn't happening. It wasn't going to happen. The U.S. doesn't do that because, of course, the United States is always, the cowboy in the white hat. It's never going to do anything bad, right? So exactly what I said was going to happen is what happened. So much for the fact checkers, right? But anyway, Russia would love to have an alternative that would link them to more countries, right? They would love to be able to avoid all of this sanctioning. I mean, who wouldn't? But here's the thing. It's not just the Russians that are worried about the way the United States uses and some would argue abuses the dollar. Other countries have watched how the U.S. has used SWIFT and more generally the dollar as a bully club, or a billy club, not a bull. Well, I guess it is kind of a bully club, but a billy club to incentivize other countries, and I'm using air quotes around incentivize, to persuade other countries to toe the foreign policy line, right? And these other countries are wary, understandably. I've used this little analogy before, but I mean, think about it. If you think somebody might pull the rug out from under you, wouldn't you try to get the rug out of your house? Get the rug out of the room, get it out from under your feet? Of course you would. Minimize risk. Any sane person is going to do that. So it's not just the Russians who see the need for an alternative system. It's not just the Russians who think that, maybe we don't want to be under or in a situation where we can be unduly influenced by the United States and punished, if we don't do what the U.S. Policymakers say we should. So it's not just the Russians who see the need for an alternative. The Russians are just the most desperate because they're the ones that are locked out right now. And, it's not just SWIFT. I think the SWIFT part is a big part of it because, that's locking Russia out of SWIFT. It was described even before it happened as a nuclear option, right? So basically, the U.S. went just about as far as it could to try to isolate and lock Russia out of the global, economy. So this is a big deal, but it's not just that. It's the dollar in general. Think about it. The U.S. froze all of the Russian dollar assets, right? And the government has even floated the idea of liquidating those Russian assets. And by liquidating, I mean effectively steal them and give the money to Ukraine. And again, if you're somebody, you're a leader in India or you're a leader in Egypt or Iran or any place, you have to at least consider getting that rug out of the room. And, this is true even if you think sanctioning is a good idea. You may look at this and say, yeah, the U.S. should be punishing Russia in this way. The invasion of Ukraine justifies locking the Russians out of the global economy. It's fair to think that, but that doesn't minimize the consequences, the fallout that could occur by following this policy. You always have to consider, the other ramifications and the unforeseen consequences, or in this case, I guess they're foreseen consequences, because I think anybody with an ounce of sense looking at this is going to be wary, unless you're one of the closest friends of the United States. And, here's the thing. A few years ago, when they were having the big debate about the nuclear treaty with Iran, and the U.S. backed out of it, and a lot of European countries didn't want to back out of that agreement with Iran. And at the time, the EU was considering an alternative payment system in order to continue doing business with Iran outside of the SWIFT system, because they knew that the U.S. could, conceivably block and punish. So it's just a matter of common sense, right? Regardless, though, the fact that it might be necessary or viewed as necessary by other countries doesn't eliminate the messy politics involved in getting a group of countries who, while they share some interest, they aren't necessarily fast friends, right? India has, conflicts with China. Everybody in this bloc doesn't necessarily agree. But I think they do agree that maybe Western dominance is a little bit of a problem in terms of a global economic and financial system. So anyway, after the summit, Russian President Vladimir Putin did concede that there was no immediate plan for an alternative payment system. He said the economic bloc have not and are not creating such a system. Nevertheless, there was plenty of rhetoric coming out of the summit that indicates the U.S. shouldn't think that de-dollarization is suddenly off the table. They're still talking about it, but what's become clear is that talk is cheap. It's easier said than done. Nevertheless, the BRICS summit adopted what is being called the Kazan Declaration, and it outlines some of the areas of agreement by members of the bloc. And I'm going to hit some of the important highlights here. Again, the bloc adopted no formal plan for an alternative payment system, but it did declare the need for reform. And it condemned, quote, the disruptive effect of unlawful, unilateral, coercive measures, including illegal sanctions. Obviously, talking about locking Russia out of SWIFT and the other economic measures that the U.S. and her allies in the West have taken. The document went on to say, we underscore the need to reform the current international financial architecture to meet the global financial challenges, including global economic governance, to make the international financial architecture more inclusive and just. So, word salad way of saying we want some alternatives here. We don't want the U.S. to be able to dominate and control this system. The Kazan Statement also left the door open for the development of a BRICS payment system in the future. So they didn't get it done, but it's not off the table. Quote, we recognize the widespread benefits of faster, low-cost, more efficient, transparent, safe, and inclusive cross-border payment instruments built upon the principle of minimizing trade barriers and non-discriminatory access. We welcome the use of local currencies in financial transactions between BRICS countries and their trading partners. Now, you kind of read between the lines there. What they're basically saying is we support and we're going to do more business transactions that don't involve dollars. See, what happens a lot of times with the SWIFT system is that when they do trade, the local currency gets turned into dollars, and then the transaction is done in dollars, and then the country on the other side, converts the dollars back to their currency. You don't really need to have the dollar as an intermediary other than the fact that that's the way the system is set up. So you're going to see, we're already seeing it, and I think you will continue to see more transactions between countries that are done in their own currencies. So in that spirit, the summit agreed to, quote, discuss and study the feasibility of the establishment of an independent cross-border settlement and depository infrastructure, in other words, another SWIFT. They call it BRICS Clear, an initiative to complement the existing financial market infrastructure as well as BRICS independent reinsurance capacity, including BRICS Reinsurance Company with participation on a voluntary basis. So in other words, not a solid plan, but a plan to make a plan, right? The declaration affirms support for a Russian proposal to create a grain trading exchange as an alternative to Western exchanges that currently set the international prices for agricultural economy. So again, looking for a way to undermine the Western monopoly on the global financial system. Quote, we welcome the initiative of the Russian side to establish a grain commodities trading platform within BRICS. It's going to be known as the BRICS Grain Exchange, and to subsequently develop it, including expanding it to other agricultural sectors. So, why didn't the summit follow Russia's lead and more aggressively pursue an alternative payment system? Well, first off, it's hard, right? You can't just snap your finger and have an alternative payment system. And University of Tasmania professor of Asian Studies James Chin told the South China Morning Post that few countries are really willing to give up the dollar entirely. And the reality is their economies are too tightly bound to the greenback right now, right? You don't want to cut off your own nose to despite your face. Chin said it is very difficult to bypass the U.S. dollar. You know, it's the dominant reserve currency. The system is set up to run on dollars. We have the petrodollar in the oil market. So dollars are everywhere. But Chin speculated that a bilateral currency agreement seems like a more reasonable path forward. In other words, countries agree, hey, we'll trade with you in rupees or we'll trade with you in rubles, and kind of start bypassing the dollar as opposed to trying to build an entirely new infrastructure. He said the dollar would likely continue as the global reserve currency, but, and this is key, on a smaller scale, with other currencies gaining an increasingly important role. Now, this isn't nearly as bad for the U.S. as, if the world ditched the dollar, but it's still a problem, and I'm going to explain why as we move towards the end of the show. Chin said a bilateral currency agreement seems to be the easiest way. In some ways, it's a bit clumsy, but it can be done if the amount is big enough. And interestingly, this dovetails with the existing China. It's an existing cross-border payment system. It's called KIPS, China Cross-Border Payment System. Earlier this month, HSBC Hong Kong announced it will formally join the KIPS system. And HSBC is one of the world's largest banking and financial institutions. According to the Financial Times, This will give, quote, the world's biggest player in trade finance a key role in Beijing's push to expand the use of the renminbi. So in other words, this payment system uses yuan, and that would benefit and raise the status of the Chinese currency. Again, probably not going to usurp the dollar, but at least erode the dollar as erode the dollar's position as the reserve currency. China actually touts KIPS as an alternative to the SWIFT payment system. It established this back in 2015, but the system has gained more attention since the U.S. and its allies locked Russia out of SWIFT. Now, KIPS isn't completely independent. It actually partners with SWIFT to kind of expand its reach, but it also has a standalone messaging system that cannot be interfered with by the United States or any other Western country, and it is currently used by 135 countries, and these are countries that are part of China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Program. When announcing HSBC Hong Kong's plan to join KIPS at a conference in Beijing, David Liao, HCBC co-chief executive of the bank's business in Chinese territory, said that the dominant role of the US dollar was being diluted. Then we have the executive dean of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. This guy's name is Wang Wen. He noted that, quote, in the past 2 years, the U.S. has promoted the weaponization of finance and abused the U.S. dollar payment system to strike, retaliate against, and sanction other countries. And this has, quote, forced countries to be willing to accept new cross-border payment systems. This is a great summary of the impact of the weaponization of the dollar. You see this erosion of the dollar because other countries want alternatives. So the bottom line here is whether BRICS develops an alternative system or not, there is plenty of momentum in that direction. There's plenty of momentum toward de-dollarization. And, we see it in other aspects of the financial system. We see it in the growing gold reserves for so many central banks. If you're going to de-dollarize, you need an alternative, right? Gold is real money. It's the perfect alternative. Everybody will take gold. Everybody recognizes gold as money. Everybody might not take the Chinese yuan or, an Indian rupee, but I darn well guarantee you that everybody's going to take gold. It is real international money. It does not have any counterparty risk. And there are a lot of central banks out there that are currently accumulating this real money. Central banks globally added a net 483 tons of gold to their reserves through the first 6 months of this year. And that was 5% above the record of 460 tons in the first half of 2023. Now, it slowed down a little bit in the second half of the year, but there are still a lot of central banks that are adding gold to their reserves. And the bottom line is central banks are also holding fewer dollars. I think I've mentioned this stat on the show before, but it bears repeating. Shares of dollars making up global reserves has dropped by 14% since the turn of the century. And this is according to data compiled by the Atlantic Council. As of 2002, dollars accounted for 72% of global reserves. Today, 22 years later, dollars make up about 58% of the global reserves. And speaking of the Atlantic Council, they also view BRICS as a long-term threat to dollar dominance, with or without its own currency or payment system. Quote, the project, and this is the Atlantic Council project, identifies BRICS as a potential challenge to the dollar's status due to the individual members' signal of intent to trade more in national currencies and the BRICS' growing share of global GDP. Now, this is not a bunch of fear-mongering rhetoric. And it's easy to look at this and get into the fear-mongering rhetoric, right? We can say, BRICS is going to create an alternative and the dollar's going to fall and nobody will want dollars anymore. So it's easy to go that direction. it's harder to look at this in a nuanced way. But the reality is, de-dollarization is happening, right? Last April, China and Brazil announced a trade deal in their own currencies, completely bypassing the dollar. Under this deal, Brazil and China will carry out trade directly, exchanging yuan for reais. I don't know if I said that right. The Brazilian currency, and vice versa, instead of converting first to dollars. And last summer, India and the United Arab Emirates also settled an oil trade without converting local currencies to dollars, the first time that had happened. And this was India's top refiner making payments for oil in rupees, okay? So what you're seeing is, you know what, we don't need dollars. I mean, why do you, right? I mean, if you're gonna do, yuan for rupees, why put dollars in the mix, right? So this is happening. It's not fear-mongering. There is a slow but steady diminishment of dollar dominance. So what? Well, obviously, if the dollar was no longer the world's reserve currency, it's going to be a big problem for the United States, right? And here's the thing. Even a small decline in dollar dominance becomes problematic for the U.S. And again, this is clearly what's happening. So why does it matter? Because global demand for dollars has basically propped up the massive federal government and all of its deficit spending. If the dollar was not the reserve currency, it would be impossible for the United States to maintain its welfare and warfare states because it would not be able to borrow and print so much money. It would push hyperinflation. We would see a constant devaluing of the dollar like we saw during the pandemic. The inflation that we saw post-pandemic, it would become the norm if the dollar wasn't the reserve currency. In fact, it would be worse than that. And really, this is just simple math, right? The demand for dollars in the global financial system allows the U.S. to print a lot more dollars than it otherwise could. The global dollar demand soaks up some of the excess and shields the U.S. from the inflationary pressure inherent in money creation, right? When Zimbabwe prints too much of its own currency, well, nobody wants it. Nobody else in the world is, picking up Zimbabwe dollars. So that money creation, that inflation is going to have a much bigger impact on the domestic economy in Zimbabwe than it does on the United States, where everybody wants dollars. And kind of here's what happens. The world makes stuff, and it sends it to the U.S. for consumers to buy, and then it takes the dollars it earns and it invests them in dollar-denominated assets, primarily U.S. treasuries. Like in a sane world, other countries would take those dollars and buy U.S. products, but the U.S. doesn't make a whole lot anymore. So instead, they invest in U.S. real estate, U.S. stocks, and U.S. treasuries. So basically, dollar dominance creates a demand for U.S. debt. U.S. debt, U.S. treasuries, bonds, are a place for other countries to park their dollars. And the scale of this is pretty staggering. When you look at this trade deficit, the November merchandise trade deficit spiked to $108.2 billion in 1 month. That's the second largest merchandise trade deficit in history. So in other words, that much more merchandise came into the United States as went out. We sent all of those dollars overseas. And you know what? Even with dollar dominance, let's be real. The world only needs so many dollars, right? There's a cap. It can max out, right? It's not infinite. There's not an infinite demand for dollars. And any reduction in the demand for dollars is going to leave more dollars circulating out there without any real purpose. They're eventually going to end up back here in the U.S. And you know what that means? Price inflation here at home. In other words, as the dollar becomes less important and other countries pivot to other forms of money, whether they be other fiat currencies, euros or yuan, or real money, gold, silver, you and I are going to feel the impact in the form of price inflation. Oh, and by the way, this is also a big problem for the federal government. when demand for its debt falls, demand for treasuries, interest rates rise. Keep in mind, Uncle Sam forked out over $1 trillion for interest expense in fiscal 2024. That was more than was spent for national defense. It was more than was spent for Medicare. The only spending category in the U.S. budget in the last fiscal year that was bigger than what was paid out for interest was Social Security. So what happens if those interest rates continue to go up and spike? What happens if the U.S.'s borrowing costs continue to increase? Well, you're going to see that share of the budget just going to pay off debt is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's going to start to squeeze other things in the budget. And this is exactly what's already happening. Treasury yields are spiking right now. We're seeing a glut of bonds. We're seeing a bear market in bonds. That means the price of treasuries are falling and interest rates, yields on those bonds are rising. And this is despite the Federal Reserve rate cuts last month, right? They're trying to push interest rates down, but they can't do it because the demand for U.S. treasuries has tanked. And if you want to kind of delve more into this, I talked about it in the last in the show last week. So check out last week's show if you haven't already. So here it is in a nutshell. Let me just kind of sum it up for you. A de-dollarization of the world economy would ultimately cause a dollar glut. The more extensive the de-dollarization, the bigger the glut. And the bigger the glut, the more the value of the U.S. currency depreciates, right? It's demand and supply. And as demand for dollars falls, the value of those dollars is going to go down, especially given the fact that the U.S. keeps creating more and more money. I've talked about this before as well. The Federal Reserve has, declared victory over price inflation. And I say that it is really surrendered to price inflation because what this means is the monetary policy is now going towards a looser monetary policy, which means more money creation. And we're seeing exactly that in the money supply. The money supply started going up again in the summer. So the government is actually creating inflation now, even as it declares victory over inflation. So at the extreme, global de-dollarization could spark a currency crisis where you see the dollar crash. And whether it's a slow erosion or a crash, you and I will continue to feel the impact through more price inflation that's eating away at the purchasing power of our dollars. And again, if you go to the worst case scenario, we're talking about hyperinflation. If the dollar falls off of its perch as the reserve currency, then the U.S. is not going to be able to print anymore. It's not going to be able to borrow and spend anymore. It would be in the situation of a Zimbabwe or a Venezuela, okay? Because those countries, part of the problem, part of the reason they faced hyperinflation was the fact that they weren't the reserve currency and nobody wanted their worthless money. So, again, this would almost certainly be the case if the dollar was knocked off its perch as the global reserve currency. So the point I really want to drive home here is we don't have to have BRICS create a new payment system or develop a new currency for that bloc to create problems for the dollar. You shouldn't look at this recent meeting and say, oh, well, they didn't do anything. There's no payment system. All is good. We don't have to worry about it. Because all we need is a slow bleeding away of dollar dominance. And again, that's exactly what's happening. Slowly, but surely. And whenever I think about this, I can't help but to go back to this old saying, things happen slowly and then all at once. You see this slow bleed, you see signs on the horizon, and all of a sudden, bam, you have the crisis. So here's the thing. You need to be prepared for an ever depreciating dollar. It might depreciate slowly. It might depreciate faster. Regardless, depreciation is happening. Your dollar is losing value. It's going to keep happening. The only question is how much and how fast. So to protect yourself, you need to do what a lot of these other central banks are doing. You need to get real money, not paper fiat that governments can manipulate at a whim to their advantage, not dollars that the government is going to create more of so that they can borrow and spend more. You need real money, gold and silver. So now is a great time to call 800-800-1865 and talk to a Money Metals, precious metals specialist, and they can help you figure out how precious metals, gold, silver, even platinum, palladium, how they can fit into your investment strategy. They can point you to some of the products that might work for you. So talk to them today. These people are fantastic and they're there to help. And again, I know a lot of people don't like to talk on the phone. Don't have to. You can go to moneymetals.com and you can just chat with a Money Metals, precious metals specialist right online, or don't talk to anybody at all. You can go to moneymetals.com and purchase whatever gold or silver products you might be interested in, whether it's coins or bars or whatever. So do it today. And that is a wrap for this episode of the Money Metals Midweek Memo. You can get more information about all of the stuff that I've talked about on the show today and a lot more over at moneymetals.com/news. And if you want to get the latest news and information relating to gold and silver right in your inbox, make sure you sign up, get on our email list. Now, of course, you can subscribe to the Midweek Memo on your favorite podcasting platform. We're on all the biggies. And if you do, you can also tune into our Market Wrap podcast every Friday, where you'll get a quick overview of the week in precious metals, along with conversations between yours truly and interesting people from the world of gold and silver. Last week, I talked to Judy Shelton, who was an economic advisor for Donald Trump and who is an advocate for the gold standard. Really interesting conversation with her. So do that. Do it today. Thank you so much for listening to this show. Again, I say this every week, but I really do appreciate it. I know there's plenty of things for you to listen to out there, and it means a lot to me that you spend a little bit of time with me each week. So I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I will be back here again behind the microphone next week.